Of Arms and Men, A History of War, Weapons, and Aggression by Robert L. O'Connell. Chapter 6. Eques. Crassus needed a military reputation. As the third member of a triumvirate that included two great soldiers, Pompey and Caesar, he had only wealth and ambition to his credit. Therefore, he jumped at the chance to lead a punitive expedition against the upstart Parthians, a feudal nobility of nomadic origins who had carved an empire out of the former dominion of the great king of Persia. In the spring of 53 BC, he crossed the Euphrates at the 37th degree latitude and headed inland with 7 legions and 4,000 Gallic cavalry. After a 4-day march, he reached the vicinity of the town of Carrhae, where he encountered the Parthian force. It was a unique deployment, the first of its kind among organized states in that its normal infantry contingent was missing, leaving only cavalry, a minority of heavily armored lancers, the nobles, and a much more numerous group of light horsemen using the composite bow. It was to this element that the battle would belong. At first contact, Crassus formed a hollow square, with his cavalry on either flank awaiting the Parthian attack which would bring the enemies to close quarters. It never came. Instead, the Parthian archers halted within effective bow range and began subjecting the legions to a withering barrage of arrows. Crassus did nothing until he realized his tormentors were being resupplied by camel train. He then sent out offensive detachments, first of cavalry, then infantry. In each case, the mounted archers feigned retreat and then surrounded and annihilated Crassus's men, firing accurately at full gallop, even out over the hindquarters, the origin of the term Parthian shot. Over the next 2 days, the slaughter continued until, out of an army of over 43,000, only 10,000 were left to escape. Weapons-wise, Rome and the legion had met their match. In over 250 years of trying, the empire would never really succeed in eradicating Parthian military power, relying primarily on diplomacy to hold it in check. This is symptomatic. As we noted earlier, politics and empire were primarily functions of agriculture, hydraulic societies, as Wittfogel calls them. But the Parthians represented nomad rule, lineal descendants of the first desert raiders. The reign of the Archadids was reasonably long, but strangely vaporous. When they became masters of the Seleucid kingdom, they took over Greek methods of administration and made use of Greek secretaries, Greek science, and the Greek language for trading. But unlike others, they were not deeply affected by Greek culture. They continued to speak their own tongue, Pahlavi, but left no written literature, no art or architecture for that matter. When their time came, they passed from the scene virtually unnoticed by history, their heritage no more substantial than the desert wind. Militarily, they were just as elusive. They would feign retreat only to attack. They would engulf rather than confront. Tactically, they cared nothing for territory, scorning the agrarian conception of battle, concentrating on killing instead. And above all, they could not be caught. The Eastern composite bow was a tremendously powerful weapon, with a man-killing range of well over 200 yards, verified by tests performed in the 19th century at the behest of Napoleon III. Nonetheless, a body of foot archers could still be run down by determined infantry on good terrain from this distance in something under a minute. Normally not enough time to do decisive damage. Yet, mount these archers on horseback, giving them adequate means of retreat, and they become practically invincible at this level of technology. This had become apparent as far back as the Assyrians, who adopted horse archers, though without a great deal of success. For as we have already seen, riding, and shooting a composite bow simultaneously requires a lifetime of training. For the common man, an opportunity afforded only by an occupation on horseback. Given the basic Homeric and Western animus against the bow, this additional difficulty was sufficient to cause the Romans, in the past so quick to pick up on foreign weapons developments, to largely ignore this one for 350 years. When cavalry was at last embraced by Rome, the bow would be used, but the lance preferred, a decision made practically unanimous by the feudal nobility of Europe. So it became one of the supreme ironies of Western military history that a culture in which all political power ostensibly rested upon coercion should come to disregard the deadliest weapon system available. For the bow did just not fit, either culturally or economically. And that apparently was paramount, although it could not preclude the likes of Genghis Khan. It could be said, without exaggerating overmuch, that the entire Middle Ages was built on a few bits of leather and metal. For without the stirrup, the medieval lancer, to which the entire economic system was dedicated, would not have constituted a credible weapon system. To a remarkable degree, the type had been anticipated long before in the development of the Parthian cataphract. Nomads had long padded their ponies against arrow wounds, and the Parthian nobility extended the practice to covering both their chargers and themselves with a thick layer of mail and even plate. This, of course, was heavy, causing them to further enlarge the sturdy products of the Nicaean stud captured from the Seleucids, in order to produce a truly monumental breed of equines, fine of foot, unlike plow horses, but barrel-chested and heavily boned and muscled enough to carry their now considerable burden. Yet the power and weight inherent in such a combination was in most ways antithetical to the agility and maneuverability required for mounted archers. Rather than the bow, the natural weapon of the cataphract was the lance. So it came to pass that the swirling mass of Parthian horse archers would be led by an elite of iron men astride huge chargers, and so heavily protected that, as Tacitus notes, such warriors could barely stand if unhorsed. This must have occurred frequently, for if the lumbering cataphract generated the requisite momentum, balance and shock absorption were other matters entirely. Though he probably had a rigid frame saddle to help prevent being knocked out over the horse's rump, a Parthian cataphract had absolutely no means of lateral stability, clinging to his mount solely through the pressure exerted by foot and thigh. Thus, any blow delivered even slightly to the left or right was likely to unhorse him. Given these conditions, the lance had to be employed primarily as a thrusting weapon operated with two hands rather than being held at rest, further eroding the viability of the man-horse synergy by precluding a firm grip on the reins and the use of an adequate shield on the opposite side. Thus, heavy cavalry remained technically deficient and still unable to break up formations of resolute infantry. Moreover, they were expensive, requiring not only a significant investment in arms and armor, but a considerable establishment to breed and care for war horses. Therefore, although the Sasanians and the Sarmatians took them over after the Parthians, they remained primarily weapons of the East and eventually faded out of existence. This is not meant to imply that the cataphract was an unattractive option. Quite the contrary. From a preferential perspective, it was close to ideal. All cavalry, particularly this kind, have certain clear psychological advantages in combat. The act of putting a man on a horse, preferably a large horse, raises him above other men. While others must walk, he rides, elevated physically and forcing those below, quite literally, to look up to him. In this respect, it is an aristocratic weapon par excellence, and the equestrian predilections of practically every ancient nobility, including even the Iron Age Greeks and pre-Republican Romans, bears this out in fact as well as theory. Also, size itself must have been an intimidating factor. Faced with something like a cataphract bearing down on him, an infantryman is unlikely to have perceived simply a man riding a horse, but rather an armored juggernaut, at once larger and more terrifying than any one of its constituent parts. Speed also must have had a telling effect. Under most conditions, an armed man riding a horse in good condition can move at between 2 and 2.5 times the rate of a similarly equipped man, either walking or running. Not only does this ensure tangible benefits in the ability to initiate and break off combat with slower adversaries, but, as has been noted before, speed appears to have a value in and of itself. Much the same thing can be said of noise. Indeed, the frequent references to the thunder of horses' hooves in descriptions of cavalry charges would seem to indicate that this was a significant element in the psychology of equestrian warfare. Cavalry, in particular the armored lancer, was a confrontational device. As with other analogous forms, the object was to close with the enemy, to run him down and impale him. It was therefore very much in the tradition which had begun with the hunting of large herbivores and had been codified and transmuted by Homer into what is now referred to as the Western military tradition. Thus, the fact that cavalry was not more of a factor in the early Middle Ages, as the historical record shows it was not, seems logically to have turned on technical considerations. This is why the introduction of the stirrup was of such significance. The so-called Ross-Brunner-White thesis, which traces the politico-economic essentials of feudalism to Charles Martel's sudden emphasis on heavy cavalry around AD 740, and this to the availability of stirrups, has been challenged on a number of grounds. Granted, it can be argued that feudalism was a more gradual process, its antecedents existing long before, and its final form not taking shape until 50 years after Charlemagne's death. Similarly, it can be maintained that the spread of the stirrup and the kind of fighting it made possible was irregular in terms of both time and geography. Yet such critiques seem, even if unconsciously, to underestimate the true significance of purely military contingencies at this point. Whenever it came, the lateral stability provided by the stirrup was real and injected a vital and heretofore missing element into shock cavalry, thereby catalyzing the characteristically rapid sequence of ancillary developments, which is typical in the evolution of dominant weapon systems. When combined with a saddle built up at the pommel and cantle for longitudinal support, the stirrup welded rider and horse together sufficiently well to open up an entirely new means of attack. Rather than thrusting out himself, the lancer could now hold his weapon at rest in the crook of his arm, using the combined weight of his body and his charging stallion to deliver a blow of unprecedented violence, a fact attested to by the sudden appearance of baffles on lances to prevent them from penetrating too far and getting stuck. This arrangement also had the additional benefit of freeing the opposite arm to control the reins and carry the kite-shaped shield, which was the rider's major means of turning aside equivalent blows. For the balance between offense and defense was also essential to the stability of the system. Not surprisingly, the distinctive Frankish throwing axe, the Francisca, would disappear in favor of a 44-inch long sword, useful on foot, but primarily aimed at providing extra reach from the back of a horse. Helmet design also improved, with the ancient crested form replaced by a highly functional conical iron headpiece with attached nose protector. The length of the mail shirt, universally the basic item of armor, was increased to cover the knees of the rider. Over time, this protection would gradually spread, with the addition of the hauberk to cover the area between helmet and shirt, gloves, and eventually mail breeches. But the essential elements of knightly equipment were in place by AD 950. So in a period as short as a century, This developmental sequence deposited an extraordinary, durable, and effective weapon system on the stage of European history, and its effect was bound to be felt both politically and economically. The exact nature of the causal relationship between the appearance of shock cavalry and feudalism is a controversial subject. Yet it seems indisputable that such a relationship did exist, and that each element reinforced the other. Given the reduced levels of economic productivity at this point in history, shock cavalry was bound to be extraordinarily costly and therefore selective. It has been estimated that the equipment to outfit one knight amounted to the cost of about 20 oxen, or the plow teams of at least 10 peasant families. Moreover, fighting in this manner was extremely demanding, requiring an extended training period and virtually constant practice. Plainly, to be successful, the participants required steady, though not necessarily intensive, economic support, and the leisure time to indulge their martial proclivities. With the exception of the metal used in arms, all the necessary elements, feed, war horses, livelihood, etc., could be supplied in an agrarian setting, either non-monetary or minimally so. Yet quite plainly, only a very few could participate, living essentially off the slender but growing surpluses such a system could offer. In return, they provided but one service, although a necessary one: protection. For beginning around AD 750, Western Europe was beset by a plague of seaborne vultures, known collectively as the Vikings, and sailing shallow draft, single-sail, square-rigged galleys not unlike those of the Mycenaean Greeks 2 millennia before. Tactically, the Vikings were ideally suited to the political ecology of the time, for the world they found in their first great series of raids into Northumbria and Aquitaine was analogous to the hair and fingernails growing on a corpse. As Georges Duby has noted, what passed for a governmental structure in Europe, and in particular the Carolingian Empire, at this point was no more than a glorified village blown up, a political edifice based on the remnants of Roman culture, which turned out to be, in fact, no more than a reassembly of the debris of old. Sailing from Norway and Denmark out of the fog of the North Sea, the Vikings descended first on the coastal towns and later traversed to the major riverine arteries, spreading havoc and inevitably disappearing before the ponderous mechanisms of Saxon and Carolingian retribution could be applied. Indeed, by camping on estuarial islets and maintaining a water barrier between themselves and their victims wherever possible, the Vikings were virtually invulnerable to political entities whose power was inversely proportional to the distance from the center of government and imperfectly linked by a chain of personal obeisance. Such a situation could only exaggerate trends already extant. Thus, in an effort to increase the mobility of his army, Charles the Bald, in AD 864, issued the Edict of Petre, ordering all free Franks who owned a horse or could afford to keep one to serve mounted. More and more, initiative was left to the local level, the most tangible effect being the growth of fortifications, first in towns and later throughout rural France, primarily in the form of earthwork-based motte and bailey castles. The sole refuge for a people terrorized by the latest wave of marauders, such fortifications enabled their masters to exact a still larger share of the constantly increasing agricultural product, and, in doing so, to further formalize the manorial system and the domination of the peasantry which it implied. For the significance of the castle was both symbolic and real, at once the perfect architectural expression of the military aristocracy. Castles also could and did control the land against raiders, their range being that of the heavy cavalry within them, about 10 miles if you wanted to be home by dark. Yet, in fact, the results of the odd confrontation between the Vikings with their generalized longboats and the terrestrials with their specialized cavalry and castles were somewhat ironic. The Viking longboats, though fast and magnificently seaworthy, were essentially without offensive capability. They were means for transport only. Raiding was accomplished through forays inland. Here, especially as marauders faded into actual conquest, the Vikings reacted symmetrically to the weapons of the defenders, learning to fight from horseback, building fortifications, and, like the Normans, beginning to live and act remarkably like those they sought to replace. But if the Vikings could be assimilated, the measures taken against them did not quickly fade away. The combination of heavy cavalry and castles had the effect of diffusing power and spreading it throughout the countryside. For if charging horses ruled the field, they could not reduce a castle. Thus, a defeated, outnumbered, or simply recalcitrant vassal could often take refuge behind his walls and wait out external authority. Politically, it spelled the collapse of centralized government, the atomization of power. For cavalry and castles formed a closed system at once, supporting and canceling out each other, but normally immune or at least highly resistant to large political groupings. Throughout the preceding chapters, it has been argued that the relationship between weapons, styles of warfare, and political systems is intimate and self-reinforcing. The feudal age, which emerged after AD 1000, is a prime example. In the absence of large, centralized, politically ambitious states, warfare lost much of its predatorial cast and took on more characteristics of intraspecific combat. As befit the age, war and fighting became a matter of class. For the aristocracy which emerged at the point when the term miles ceased to mean soldier and began to mean the knight, bore the exclusive right to bear arms. Membership, though increasingly hereditary, especially at the upper reaches of the nobility, was primarily defined by the ability to fight, specifically as shock cavalry. From the greatest lords to the most minor henchmen, all shared the socialization process surrounding this most demanding means of combat. F.M. Stenton has called the apprenticeship preceding knighthood the most significant fact in the organization of feudal society. Beginning at puberty and frequently requiring long residence and training among peers in the households of the great lords. It created a corporate self-consciousness, a cosmopolitan fraternity of arms, confident in its solidarity and reveling in its traditions. It is frequently said that the self-image of the knight was delineated chiefly by two ideal virtues: loyalty to one's liege or overlord and prowess in combat. In the case of the former, although it remained vigorous locally, there was always room for treachery and rebellion regionally and beyond. In the second instance, however, there can be no doubt as to the importance of fighting well. As Lynn White Jr. notes, the new mode of combat, with its high mobility and fearful impact, opened fresh fields for individual prowess. Certainly, there are instances of large-scale battles and disciplined maneuvers by squadrons of knights, but the emotional focus of combat had drawn down again to the level of the individual. As a motive for belligerence, politics never entirely disappeared, but its impact was fragmented and therefore subject to usurpation by other values. Gradually, fighting became a formalized ritual for attaining dominance, remarkable in its similarities to those of certain other mammals. Archetypical of this turn of events was the development of tournaments, those elaborate, deadly, and completely realistic games of war to which the knightly class became hopelessly addicted, beginning in the early 12th century. It has been frequently noted that the circumstances of vassalage and later primogeniture created a class of surplus males, the younger sons of the knightly aristocracy for whom the choices were reduced to the priesthood or a life of adventure among wandering bands of peers, the so-called knights errant. Genetic strategies being what they are, many chose or were thrust into the latter category. For, as Dubé notes, these adventures were also revealed as quests for wives, perhaps first and foremost. All Jouvenets were on the lookout for an heiress. Such a union was the quickest and safest means of gaining land and support. This being the case, however, there was bound to be competition, and given the importance attached to prowess at arms, the development of something like the tournaments seems entirely logical. It can, of course, be argued, as did Sidney Painter in his biography of William Marshall, that women were neither present at early tournaments, though they later became assiduous spectators, nor the prime aim of participation, that being ransom or the capture of horses and weapons. Yet this misses a larger point. Tournaments were from the beginning an opportunity to identify and rank dominant males. Indeed, Painter's own hero, the redoubtable William Marshall, was quite literally a product of the tourney. The younger son of a minor vassal but a formidable fighter, he wandered from event to event for 15 years, building a near-legendary reputation which earned him an heiress, great estates, and ultimately the Regency of England. The medieval dream. Of course, war provided similar though less observable opportunities for such displays. And in many instances, even the participants might have had trouble telling the two apart, for both were so laden with the stuff of biological ritual that it is possible to wonder whether this had not become the major intent. The very nature of the joust, high speed, head-on, collision with protruding tusk-like lances, invites comparison with the spectacular ceremonial combats of a variety of ungulates, significantly perhaps non-predators. As with all such contests, combat was individualized and hemmed in by an elaborate web of submission-related rules. The essence of what has come to be known as military chivalry was illustrated when William Marshall, vassal of the warring Henry Plantagenet, happened upon the ostensible enemy, Richard Coeur de Lion, with neither hauberk nor mail, and therefore very vulnerable. "By the legs of God, Marshal, do not kill me. That would not be right, for I am unarmed." Grumbling, Marshal shifted his lance and merely ran through Richard's horse. Although it would not be hard to cite similar examples, this is not meant to imply that fighting had become non-lethal. This was a violent age. Genealogical evidence and knowledge of contemporary medical practice indicate that the life of a knight was both dangerous and prone to be short. Nonetheless, when compared with something like the Roman legion, it is fair to say that killing itself had become a secondary objective. Furthermore, the state of arms appears to have reinforced this situation. Although the mounted lancer possessed extraordinary offensive power, he was also extremely well protected, his kite-shaped shield being optimized to turn aside a lance. Thus, symmetrically armed opponents frequently neutralized each other. Certainly, knights occasionally turned on the lightly armed infantry of the day with deadly effect. Yet, as befit the interspecific image, real combat, the combat that mattered in the eyes of the participants, was necessarily fought between equals in arms as well as class, and as such, often produced few casualties. Thus, Marshall did not spare Richard's life, as refused to fight him without the proper accoutrements. Given these conditions, the weaponry of shock cavalry proved highly durable, dominating Europe well into the 14th century. Deadly to outsiders and those below, it was nevertheless eminently usable among the ruling classes, the ideal instrument of the status quo. As is common of weapons in nature specialized to enforce dominance, the vestments of heavy cavalry were extremely formidable visually, relying on a heavy measure of implied threat. The Middle Ages was a time overlaid with symbolism, and the charging armored juggernaut and the crenellated battlements of the medieval castle took their places as the prime archetypes of coercive power, images of such potency that they would endure long past their tactical demise, to condition weapons choice right into the industrial era. There was but one exception to the ideal match between knightly arms and heroic warfare, yet even it enriched the symbolism, for one knight encased in full battle array was virtually indistinguishable from another, a situation which tended to defeat the whole purpose of combat. In response, individual warriors took to adorning their shields with specific insignia, coats of arms. Genetic advertising, it was in one respect analogous to the decorative coloration of competing males in numerous species. Yet it was utterly functional in another regard, for if brave deeds were to be remembered, their perpetrators had to be identifiable. And so there grew up a sort of international corporation of heralds, the regulators of civilized warfare, who hung like scavengers about the battlefields and tourney grounds, their designated function being to ascertain brave deeds, assign credit, and name names to be later recorded by a corps of chroniclers dedicated to embellishing these bare facts. Thus, chivalry gave birth to a philosophy of history which, as Lynn White Jr. notes, proclaimed the immortalization of brave deeds to be the principal duty of Clio. A similar urge gave rise to the primary secular literary manifestation of the age, the chanson de geste. One has only to peruse the meticulously detailed blow-by-blow accounts in the Chanson de Roland, or encounter the adulterous arrogance of a Tristan, to realize that these tales are in fact the analogues of Homer, and still earlier, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The same confrontational values and worship of close combat had been accurately transmitted to these medieval literary bruisers, further reinforcing their primacy and ensuring they would be passed on. Just as in the Iliad, horses and arms specialized for close combat were inevitably singled out as items of great worth. Swords, in particular, were treated with extreme, at times almost unbelievable, reverence. Thus, Zoe Oldenburg notes with wonderment that Roland, who through the entire poem has only a few words of praise for his betrothed, breaks into a regular soliloquy when, at the point of death, he realizes that his sword, Durendal, epic blades were inevitably named, might fall into the hands of the hated Saracens. Ah, Durendal, good sword, your unlucky day, for I am lost and cannot keep you in my care. Ah, Durendal, how beautiful and bright, so full of light, all on fire in the sun. While most protagonists were less pathetic, they would have readily agreed with El Cid, the Campeador. Lances and swords must be our shelter, or else on this meager earth we cannot live. For weapons in the chansons, as in life, were clearly and premeditatedly instruments of class, tailored to the needs of the aristocracy. Armorers, on the other hand, are lower class figures and barely mentioned. Only their creations matter. Nor does the bow play a significant literary role. While not necessarily treated with the disdain of a Homer, it is, when in the hands of the hero, preeminently a weapon of the hunt, not of battle. Combat, when it comes, is formalized, honorific, and inevitably fought with the traditional instruments matched symmetrically, even against the Moors. It could hardly be otherwise. Just as with the Iliad, these gore-encrusted passages formed the archetypes of combat which fixed military stereotypes in men's minds. Almost by definition, they had to be fought according to the rules. Combat was simply too important to have it any other way. For although heroes nominally subscribed to other values, it was prowess, not truth, or justice, or piety, which was the ultimate measure of behavior. Thus, Tristan could offer himself for combat to prove he had not slept with the king's wife, although it was obvious he had. In this and other respects, life followed art. The values of combat did in fact spill over into a number of societal functions from which they are strictly segregated today. As one consequence, in most feudal societies, some form of ritual Pardon me. As a consequence, in most feudal societies, some form of trial by combat was incorporated into the judicial structure, particularly for high crimes. While such practices were probably more honored in the breach than the observance, we nevertheless see William Marshall, at the ripe age of 66, offering to defend himself by force of arms against the charge of harboring a traitor. In fact, by giving shelter to his renegade friend, William de Briouze, he had done just that. But clearly more remarkable than these judicial encroachments was the effect of fighting values upon the medieval church, and it should be added, vice versa. For if this was a time of rampant, almost anarchistic bellicosity, it was also a period suffused with piety. Under the circumstances, it was nearly inevitable that one would affect the other. Fighting being the major educational preoccupation of aristocratic youth, and the church being the key repository for the younger sons of the nobility, it is not surprising that among the ranks of the ordained were those who joined in the interminable brawling of the age. In fact, as well as fiction, we find individual clergy battling side by side and with much the same gusto as their secular peers. Yet, organizationally, intellectually, and morally, the church increasingly came to oppose the climate of intramural violence and did what it could to mitigate its consequences. Commencing around AD 990, basically coincidental with the collapse of royal authority in France, the movement known as the Peace of God began as an attempt to protect sacred things, that is, the servants and sanctuaries of Christianity, from the depredations of local strongmen. Backed by meaningful threats of excommunication, the effort was basically a success and was quickly expanded to include the protection of all the unarmed, women, children, the old, and the poor. Yet these first councils did not deny the aristocracy the right to fight. They sought only to isolate the violence to men-at-arms, even if these did include certain of the clergy. By the end of the 10th century, however, bearing and using arms began to seem evil in the same way as greed and the sexual act did to those in the forefront of the movement to reform the church. Consequently, knights were urged to abstain from battle, much as everyone else was urged to abstain from other pleasures of the flesh, for the good of the soul. Thus, peace was to reign from Wednesday evening to Monday morning. By extending the areas from which war was forbidden, first to certain places, then to particular classes, and finally to a specific time frame, the church was moving in the direction of prohibiting bloodshed among Christians. But if this was to be the case in an age seething with violence, there had to be some outlet. Thus was born the idea of the Crusades. The train of events set in motion by the Council of Clermont in 1095 was unique in a number of respects. Yet the military dimension was as astonishing as any. As noted earlier, the fragmentation of European politics appears to have left the institution of war open for co-option by other sources of motivation. And it was into this void that the church had moved. The pugnacity of the warrior class would be turned outward against the hated Muslims and dedicated to the sacred mission of recovering the Holy Lands. Yet those forces, once unleashed, proved not so easy to control. Certainly, in terms of military organization, the expeditions which resulted were only minimally imprinted with Christian influence. They were instead thoroughly representative of what war had become in Western Europe. If the Roman legion, so thorough in its organization and subordination that it seems almost genetically controlled, can be compared to an army of insects, then the original Crusader contingents can be likened to a wandering herd of male ungulates, its constituents jostling constantly for control, periodically breaking apart and moving off in different directions, but all driven by a larger force at once compelling and evanescent. Nevertheless, tactically they were not to be taken lightly. Both of the major military powers in the Near East at the time, the Seljuk Turks, the Crusaders' main adversaries, and the Empire of Byzantium, were capable of fielding forces of a high order. While the Turks relied on more traditional but still more very formidable Asian horse archers, The Byzantines carried on the Hellenistic tradition of diversified forces and the Roman legacy of professionalism to create a combined arms force remarkable even today for its complexity and sophistication. Yet the man-for-man superiority of the European shock cavalry was such that it not only negated its own manifest organizational deficiencies, but also allowed for what amounted to a military miracle, the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. Yet the First Crusades also began a sequence of developments, the consequences of which neither Christian authority nor the European aristocracy could possibly foresee. In particular, the Church was finding its involvement with war and weapons less temporary and controllable than it might have expected. For conquest required protection. Yet the temporal rulers of what were known as the Latin states were dramatically short of manpower and funds. So the Church came to countenance the formation of military orders, the Knights Templars, Knights Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order, initially to protect pilgrims, but shortly to take a major role in the defense. But if the orders could not ultimately save the Latin states, the idea of God's own heavy cavalry battling heathen in the land of Christ had enormous appeal, and they would quickly grow rich and fiercely independent, each destined for a remarkable, if not necessarily pious, future. The Church not only had trouble controlling its Christian soldiers, the technical course of war would also take a new and unexpected turn. As military confrontations go, the three Crusades were unusually asymmetric in tactics and weaponry since the powers involved had long been separated both geographically and culturally. Under the circumstances, a premium was placed on experimentation and the exploitation of weakness. Thus, after suffering several drubbings in close combat with knights, the Seljuk horse archers took to avoiding pitched battle and concentrated instead on harassment with their fine composite bows. For their part, the Crusaders gradually discovered the uses of infantry and firepower, more accurately quarrel power, to hold ground and bring the enemy to bear at long range. Now, foot soldiers had never disappeared from European warfare, but in an environment where heavy cavalry was both extremely aggressive and symmetrically oriented, they were seldom decisive. Yet the tactical situation was entirely different in the Middle East, and besides, the Christian infantry had a new weapon. Though the crossbow had been rediscovered and available in Europe since the early 11th century, it is probable that it was brought to the Holy Lands primarily as a novelty, perhaps mainly for hunting. Yet the weapon had two characteristics which made it an instant winner in this arena. Unlike a reflex bow, it could be shot accurately with very little training, and more important, it packed the power to knock a man out of the saddle at ranges of up to 100 yards. In a climate of sporadic attack where its slow rate of fire made little difference, the crossbow by the Third Crusade became a key element in a sophisticated infantry-cavalry combined arms team crafted by Richard Coeur de Lion to fight on the march. But its implications went far beyond the Latin states. By AD 1100, the square-headed, armor-piercing quarrel had become commonly available, and the crossbow was being used in Europe to shoot down knights. To a political and social structure, welded together with chivalric fighting skills acquired at great costs, such a development could only prove ominous. Once again, the Church stepped into the breach, with the Second Ecumenical Lateran Council outlawing the use of the crossbow among Christians in 1139. As perhaps man's first overt attempt at arms control, the edict deserves more attention than it usually receives. In particular, its effort to enforce weapons symmetry and what amounted to the technological status quo would prove characteristic of arms control in the future. There was also an element of implied cynicism, or at least situational ethics here, that would tend to be true of other efforts in this direction. For the Church in no way discouraged the use of the crossbow against Muslims. This was symptomatic of European Christianity's entire involvement with war during this period. Having failed to deal with the root causes of violence, the Church sought to turn it outward against those seen as alien. Indeed, this also appears to be the key to the feudal aristocracy's tactical flexibility and open-mindedness toward new weaponry while in the Holy Lands. As might be expected from anthropological precedent, the decorum of war and the aversion to weapons deemed less than honorific were sharply reduced in fighting against those seen as alien, even if conceded to be fellow humans. Yet such a breakdown was bound to reverberate back across Europe as crusaders returned with these lessons fresh in their minds. Feudalism and knightly supremacy would last well into the 14th century, but they would never be the same after the experience in the Holy Lands. In fact, the crossbow's slow rate of fire and proneness to break in wet weather limited its actual effectiveness in Europe, especially in pitched battle. Yet its psychological impact cannot be dismissed. The ancient prejudices against personal military missile weapons had been compromised, if not totally dispelled. Military prepotency was no longer exclusively a matter of one class, an event dramatized by the death of Richard Coeur de Lion in 1199, shot down by a quarrel as he rode gaily before a besieged castle. Like all armored vehicles when threatened, knights took refuge in more protection. Mail would gradually be replaced by plate, and armor would be extended, with limited success, to the horse. Knights would grow steadily slower and still less maneuverable until they could hardly move unaided. Yet never again would they feel immune to all but other knights. Something analogous happened to the castle. As might be expected in an era of fortified places, the siege played a major role in medieval warfare. Rather than a series of pitched battles, war was often a matter of creeping advances from one fortified place to another. But, as befits the general encroachment of intraspecific values during this period, the inherent ruthlessness of this type of combat was mitigated by a number of factors. Perhaps more frequently than actual investment, castles were simply bargained for and exchanged through a transfer of allegiance. Otherwise, the siege was primarily passive. While starvation was the obvious threat, it too was softened by common resort to truces and a variety of safe conducts. Prior to the Crusades, in cases where fortresses were actually overwhelmed, the technical means brought to bear were not impressive, consisting primarily of traditional battering rams, scaling ladders, and undermining techniques effective primarily because of the fairly primitive state of the defenses. Yet contact with the East changed much of this. The elaborate Byzantine city defenses, consisting of double and triple lines of massive turreted walls, particularly impressed the Europeans. Nothing like this existed in the West, and it resulted in a virtual revolution in castle construction during the 12th century. However, as Oman notes, the Byzantines also retained all the major engines of Roman siegecraft: the vinea and testudo, the torsion catapult, onager, and ballista. While the sources are unclear as to the mechanisms of transmission, it seems hardly coincidental that large stone throwers made their appearance in the West by 1147. This, in turn, set off a rapid sequence of improvements, leading ultimately to the counterweight-powered trebuchet, a machine which modern experiments have shown to be capable of casting rock of 300 pounds for distances of up to 300 yards. Walls now actually could be shattered and broken down from a long range, and residences subjected to bombardment. Yet it would be difficult to demonstrate that the balance between defense and offense was in any fundamental sense upset. Fortifications were greatly improved in design and solidity, while instruments such as the torsion catapult were often extremely useful in fending off attack. Rather, the real effect of the techniques brought back from the East was to raise the level of violence and the cost of waging war, the logic of which pointed to larger political amalgams and more centralized control. This, like the crossbow, did not result in immediate change. Yet the diffusion of power had been reversed, and it was only a matter of time until the military system which had enforced it would be broken down. There was an analog at sea. While commerce and piracy never exactly ceased in northern waters prior to the Crusades, the Vikings' inability to tell the difference between the two and the overwhelmingly agrarian nature of European society ensured that the focus of combat and weapons development would be in a non-maritime direction. The Viking type, itself innovative structurally with its compact internal frame and flexible clinker-built shell, did undergo some further development, but in a very predictable direction. By the year 1000, the craft had been gradually lengthened to produce an elite of first longships, then dragon ships, a rudimentary hierarchy of ships prematurely abbreviated by the tendency of such elongated hulls to bend or hog amidships. British and Northern European warships added fore and aft fighting castles. Yet they remained, unlike their Scandinavian cousins, basically square-rigged or assisted longboats without fundamental means of offense. The Crusades exposed the Western Europeans to a much more sophisticated naval world. Since AD 600, naval warfare in the Eastern Mediterranean had been dominated by the various iterations of a basic ram-based bireme developed by the Byzantines and known as the dromon, or runner. Though similar in conception to the galleys of the ancient world, it carried two significant innovations: a triangular, or Latin, rig, which allowed it to sail as close as 60 degrees to the wind, and Greek fire, an incendiary liquid, probably a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and petroleum, shot at short ranges from a hydraulic siphon in the bow. An interesting anticipation of the application of chemical energy to warfare, Greek fire was premature in that it capitalized solely on the combustive, not propulsive, possibilities of such mixtures. Yet the dromon itself would be adopted basically without change by the Muslims and the Italian commercial states. In spite of its static design, the dromon's continued existence testified to a level of naval organization, shipbuilding skill, and commerce unknown in Northern Europe. Western Europeans, such as Richard Coeur de Lion, who was forced to give battle to a particularly large dromon while approaching Palestine, could not have failed to be impressed. By the same token, the influx of crusaders and the opportunity to transport them not only increased commerce in the Eastern Mediterranean, but exposed the ambitious maritime states of Italy to the possibilities of trade with Northern Europe. While direct commercial and technical interaction would come somewhat later, the Crusades' effect of raising the general level of trade and transport in Northern Europe would also lead to a renewed interest in ship design, the most noteworthy product of which was the development of the large ocean-going cog. Basically a very beamy sailing transport, the cog revealed considerable military potential in her sheer size, height, and ability to carry fighting men. A sort of castle at sea. One might almost say a bridge between the medieval fortress and the battleship. Only the cog's lack of speed and maneuverability allowed the Scandinavian type to persist lingeringly until the 14th century. But if the cog could not catch those who might harass her, neither could her opponents successfully attack. And it was this defensive capability which proved critical to the cog's success as a trader. Within confines set by slowly improving navigational tools, well-mannered cogs, like those of the Hanseatic League, might now ply the high seas with relative impunity, carrying volumes of cargo undreamed of just a few generations before. Thus, by 1250, as Richard Unger notes, more people, both northern and southern, were engaged in seaborne commerce than at any time since the late Roman Empire. The need to protect and extend this trade would soon lead to more formalized navies and specialized weaponry. But these were expensive and therefore in consonance with land-borne trends favoring larger political entities, which would in turn create the conditions to foster an acceleration in creative naval architecture. But before this could take place, something entirely unexpected came on the scene. It was as if the desert wind had whispered to the nomad horse archers that their time was growing short, that soon great change would forever remove their chance to rule. So they burst out of the Gobi, swallowing whole nations in their path. The terrifying possibilities of the desert raider disciplined and brought to fruition in the invincible armies of Genghis Khan. For if the stirrup had made the night possible, it had been taken up considerably earlier, in Central Asia, enabling horse archers to ride and shoot with unprecedented effectiveness. In a tier extending from Afghanistan to Mongolia, an environment harsh beyond all measure of European experience, men learned to use these tools to the absolute limits of human skill and endurance. Here there was no margin for error. The sparseness of the land and the ferocity of the climate worked on man and horse and equipment to remove all that was not essential, to produce a warrior as cruel and free from ceremonialism as he was self-sufficient. And of these, none was harder and more ruthless than the nomadic Mongolian tribesmen living in and around the Gobi Desert, where in an endless combat among themselves and their neighbors, they perfected the sweeping tactics of ruse and lightning attack. Clothed in sheepskin and light armor of boiled hides, requiring only powdered millet and the milk of the mares they rode, which are small, agile ponies almost immune to cold and feeding on pasturage, not fodder. He was armed with a superb composite bow of up to 165 pounds draw that could be shot with devastating power and accuracy. These crusty specimens were the raw material for what would become perhaps the most voracious fighting force ever assembled. Yet this required organization and direction, a catalyst to transform what was before no more than a swirling mass of convoluted violence. In 1167, the year of the pig, it was Mongolia's fate to be visited by a genius, born on that date, according to legend, with a clot of blood in his fist the size of a knucklebone. Temujin, they called him, after a Tartar captive, as was the custom. He was the son of a minor chieftain, but spent his youth in extreme privation, having been cast adrift with his mother and 6 other children after the father succumbed to poison. In an environment normally fatal to those without tribal protection, the family survived, doubtless due in part to the growing skill and cunning of the oldest son. For Temujin's name was soon spoken around the camps with increasing frequency as a bold and enterprising young man. He married well, made astute alliances, and was soon at the head of a band of 20,000 horsemen. Yet as he moved from battle to battle, eliminating his enemies one by one, he would never forget an insult or leave a grudge unanswered. They are the soldiers of the Uruds and Manguds, warned one nomad who had seen Temujin's army fight before. They pursue men like game. They slay them and take from them everything. By 1206, he was proclaimed Supreme Khan, or Genghis Khan, of all who dwell in tents of felt. This was important, for Genghis Khan was not simply a leader of the Mongols. In his time, he would recruit commanders of 20 nations. His was to be an army of nomads, and his train of conquest an outbreak of a way of life. It was in his first imperial campaign against the Qin, an invasion prompted by a 50-year-old murder, that he first revealed himself. For he had the mind of a herdsman, a keeper of goats and sheep, and now he would collect nations in the same manner. The army which he set upon the inhabitants south of the Great Wall was totally cavalry, yet utterly disciplined, organized pyramidally according to the ancient formula of multiples of 10. It maneuvered its more numerous adversaries like a pack of well-trained sheepdogs. The horse archer remained dominant, but appropriate weapons were adopted as the situation demanded. Having encountered heavy infantry and cataphracts, shock cavalry was quickly added, armed with lances and captured mail. Similarly, when frustrated by the walled cities of northern China, the Mongols seized upon the full range of Chinese siege engines and methodically recruited a corps of captured technicians to work them. This was typical. Subjugated populations were viewed as chattel to be exploited for their skills, or killed. The cruelty of Genghis Khan's armies is of course legendary. Yet his was the callousness of the shepherd, thinning the flock and then setting it up for future shearing. The nomad's contempt for the sedentary way of life was proverbial, and in this context, the agriculturalist became virtually a separate species, to be preyed upon and exploited rather than fought with as an equal according to intraspecific custom. The record is full of ghastly tactical tricks played upon the nomad's opponents with horrific effect, and all are united by a uniform Mongol disregard of any shared humanity between themselves and those they attacked. The theme was continued and intensified when the Khan turned westward against the Khwarezmian kingdom of Persia, again on the pretext of a murdered ambassador. Proclaiming himself the flail of God to the citizens of the captured Bukhara, he waged a war that in 3 years left the entire region blighted. Terror-induced passivity was the intent, and atrocity and rapid movement the major means of accomplishment. There was an oft-repeated story in Ibn al-Athir telling of a Mongol soldier who, having taken a captive but lacking a sword to dispatch him, simply told the man to lie down and wait until he returned, which of course the prisoner did. Collectively, this was exactly the intended effect of an encounter with the Khan's so-called horde, ironically named since in reality the invaders were almost invariably outnumbered by their victims. Fear and exaggeration radiate outward like ripples in a pond. And it is probable that Western Christendom first heard of the terrible scourge from the east shortly after the nomad captain Subutai led a raiding column into the lush pastures of Azerbaijan, crushing first the armies of Georgia in 1221, and then a heterogeneous assemblage of Russian princes. But at this point, the territory stretching beyond the Holy Lands was virtually a vacuum, and word of an attack from this quarter must have been greeted with incomprehension and disbelief. Yet the great raid of Subutai proved invaluable to the Mongols in terms of military intelligence. And it was at this point, most sources agree, that a general invasion of Europe was first conceived. Characteristically, it did not come for 15 years, put off until 1237 by the death of Genghis Khan and the choice of his successor. Yet, delay in no way diminished the fury of the onslaught or enhanced Christendom's ability to deal with it. The contrasts between the adversaries could not have been more stark. European armies were at this point basically crowds of individuals, key members fighting in a manner heavily laden with intra-specific features. The Mongols, on the other hand, were meticulously disciplined and governed by only the stark logic of predation. Perhaps equally detrimental was the agriculturalists' view of territory. Battle among sedentary peoples almost always boiled down to a matter of physical displacement. Yet the occupation of space meant little to the nomad. Their swirling tactics, feigned retreat, and sudden assault were the warlike evocations of a spirit which knew no fixed domicile. The objective was to kill and subjugate. Thus, in the 3 years of intermittent fighting, most of what then constituted Russia was utterly cowed, and its richest city, Kiev, destroyed. The invaders then moved into Poland, where they sacked the lovely city of Krakow on Palm Sunday 1241. Bypassing Breslau, they converged on Liegnitz, where Duke Henry of Silesia and the Teutonic Order had collected a heterogeneous force of between 20 and 30,000 Poles and German knights to bar the way into the Holy Roman Empire. The day ended with Henry's head on a pike and 9 bags of ears being collected from the European dead. Hungary was next, invaded from at least 4 directions. Once again, Christendom and chivalry took a stand under King Bela at Mohi, only to be virtually annihilated by the loss of 65,000 men. On Christmas Day, 1241, the invaders crossed the frozen Danube, and appeared to be heading toward Vienna. There was nothing to stop them from plunging deep into Germany or the rich commercial states of Italy. Yet, as Europe watched in disorganized horror, the Mongols did something very much in character. They began to retreat as unexpectedly as they had come. Whether because Hungary marked the western terminus of the steppes, or because of growing dynastic quarrels, the nomad thrust into Europe melted away with the snow in the spring of 1242, never to return. True enough, nomad imperialism did form lasting tyrannies in primitive Russia and Central Asia. Yet those in advanced Persia and China lasted less than 100 years. The horse archer was, at this point in history, the deadliest weapon system known to man. This had long been true. But it was an arm resting on a way of life incapable of assimilating advanced political and economic forms. As J.J. Saunders notes, Mongol culture was without architecture or even the concept of settled towns. It lacked manufactures or writing. The secret history of the Mongols, from which so much knowledge of the Khan is derived, is the sole historical document of an otherwise illiterate race. Their power rested solely on their military skill and the deadly combination of bow and horse. Yet the future of weaponry lay in Europe, first in social change, then in a technological revolution which would relegate even the horse archer to the status of an anachronism. By the year 1300, the winds of change could be felt blowing from a number of quarters. Over the previous century, the crossbow had been joined by several other new infantry weapons, such as the Lucerne hammer and the halberd, a combination pike and battle axe, which, according to Oman, could cleave a helmet or a shield like pasteboard. Foot soldiers were now also better equipped defensively, armor protection being no longer the sole prerogative of the mounted knight. All of this, moreover, was indicative of the growing sophistication and productivity of medieval ferrous metallurgy, which after the year 1225 began to take off. Ultimately, this factor, when combined with the invention of firearms, would change weapon design fundamentally. Yet in the beginning, the transition would take place according to more conventional means. At the end of the 13th century, in the mountain fastness of Switzerland, the urge for independence combined with a strong egalitarian streak to produce a nascent confederation of independent cantons and the beginnings of a national army. Poor but independent, not serfs, but free peasants and burghers, the Swiss naturally gravitated toward one another, fighting in close formation from the beginning. In their early battles with the Habsburgs and Burgundian nobility, they favored the relatively short, 6 to 10 feet, halberd. But as the need to repel cavalry charges became more apparent, the primary arm gradually shifted to a 19-foot-long iron-tipped pike that was a virtual reincarnation of the Macedonian sarissa. The tactical formation which emerged, a human hedgehog fronted by 4 rows of spears, was a familiar one. The Swiss, like the Sumerians and the Hellenes, reacted to analogous socio-economic conditions by introducing the phalanx to the battlefields of Europe. The politico-military parallels with the past are remarkable. As before, near total reliance was placed on the foot soldier, with cavalry or missile weaponry being virtually ignored. Moreover, as with earlier phalanxes, the spirit of equal participation, more than obedience, drove the Swiss formations into battle. Before La Bicocca, the cry went up, "Where are the officers, the pensioners, the double paymen? Let them come out and earn their money fairly for once. They shall all fight in the front rank today." And so they did, taking the head of the leading column and dying almost to a man. Here again, the inherent lethality of phalanx warfare stood in marked contrast to the armored roughhouse of the knightly joust. The Swiss fought with a ferocity that appalled contemporaries, making a particular point of neither giving nor receiving quarter. Rather than courtly surrender and elaborate ransoming procedures, battle for the Swiss was reduced to stark life or death terms. Like the Greeks, the Swiss would also recognize the monetary possibilities of tactical ascendancy and became great mercenaries. Indeed, pas d'argent, pas de Suisses, no money, no Swiss, would become a sort of national motto. Yet gradually, exposure to the Swiss formations brought forth predictable reactions. In Germany, Emperor Maximilian raised a corps of pikemen and halberdiers, the Landsknecht, trained to fight in exactly the manner of the Swiss. But if they suffered heavily in symmetrical confrontations with the Germans, the Swiss fared even less well against the Spanish, who, as Machiavelli noted, took a leaf out of the Roman text, having no difficulty except that of getting near enough to the Swiss to reach them with the sword. Swiss battle formations would remain viable until the early years of the 16th century, but they would do so as one of several competing styles of warfare, neither unique nor invincible. Meanwhile, something analogous, but in other ways entirely new, had transpired across the English Channel. Since the Norman conquest of 1066, Britain had been ruled by a feudal nobility, which, though in the process of assimilation, remained arrogant and perceptibly alien. Their weapons, as might be expected, were the classic instruments of shock cavalry, and came to symbolize their domination. On the other hand, military archery, though it had no previous particular significance among Anglo-Saxons, began to grow in popularity among the lower classes, borrowed from the still independent Welsh. Thus, the semi-legendary figure of Robin Hood takes on particular significance, at once a symbol of national resistance and an archetype of the men now taking up the bow. Yet in a larger sense, the inherent prejudices against the bow and its ability to kill at long range were being further broken down. Rather than the instrument of Paris, the adulterer, the bow became, in the English context, the arm of the patriotic underdog. The weapon itself is of some interest. The crossbow was certainly known in England during this period, being banned by the aristocracy in the Magna Carta in 1215. Yet the device was also spurned by the yeomanry, who chose instead the longbow, a weapon so simple that it was known as far back as the late Mesolithic period. Instead of being pieced together from several disparate materials, the longbow was formed from a single carefully shaped piece of wood. Yet its simplicity belied the sophistication and awesome capabilities. The key to the longbow was the type and placement of its material. Though they could be and were shaped out of elm, hazel, ash, and other secondary timbers, none could touch yew for power and durability. Yet the true bow lay well inside, embedded in the heart of these sacred and poisonous trees. As Robert Hardy, a contemporary expert on the bows, notes, it has been discovered again, or perhaps it was a knowledge never quite lost, that within a yew log, rightly cut from the tree, are the natural components of the self-composite weapon, the perfect natural material to resist tension, the sapwood, lying next to the perfect natural material to resist compression, the hardwood. The emergent bow was not flat-bellied as is common today, but rather more in the shape of a long, tapered cylinder or oblate. The thicker the section, the greater the power, but also the more brittle. So increments in girth had to be accompanied by proportional increases in length, ergo the terminology. They were indeed long bows, the most powerful at Agincourt probably measuring 6 feet 4 inches and achieving a draw of 120 pounds. Obviously, the strength and coordination required to shoot such an instrument with any degree of accuracy was not trivial. In fact, it was a skill which not only required considerable instruction but was easily lost, thereby necessitating constant practice. Yet a fully trained longbowman was a formidable military asset, capable of piercing mail consistently and plate at short ranges, and attaining a rate of fire of up to 12 arrows a minute, far faster than a crossbow. Capabilities like these were not likely to be missed by those interested in power. Such a man was Edward I, intent as he was on bringing his rowdy nobility to heel and creating what amounted to a national army under his control. Having seen firsthand the effectiveness of Welsh archers, he set about recruiting skilled units from places like Gwent and Macclesfield and using them to train his own levies, gradually building numbers sufficient for massed formations. But these were not the passive arrow lofters of the transnational tyranny. They were highly motivated free men, armed and ready for close combat, should their primary weapon fail or ammunition run short. True, elements were recruited from pardoned criminals, but in general they constituted a disciplined and stable fighting force, the heart of a professionalized field army with which the English monarchy sought to enforce its hereditary claims in France during the 100 Years' War. As John Keegan explains, the key to British tactics was the establishment of a narrow-fronted killing zone around 200 yards deep, into which several thousand arrows could be launched in sheets at approximately 10-second intervals. Such a deployment took utter, some might say unfair, advantage of the confrontational ethos of the feudal warrior. And on 3 separate occasions, Crécy-en-Ponthieu, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Agincourt, 1415, the flower of French knighthood insisted on charging like lemmings into this lethal space with disastrous results. losing 1,500, 2,000, and 6,000 of their number, respectively. In all cases, it was the asymmetric nature of the confrontations which was responsible for their lopsided deadliness. The French urge to close and the inability to inflict damage at other than point-blank range sealed their fate. The English longbow was too powerful and could take effect at too long a range. The time to target casualty ratio, which had previously doomed the foot archer, now had been reversed in his favor. In an effort to compensate, the knights sent their chargers, which could not be armored effectively against the galling waves of arrows, to the rear. Yet dismounted, the knights not only prolonged their time in the killing zone, but discarded their major military virtue, momentum. Besides, compensation could only go so far. The obvious solution, adopting the longbow himself and fighting symmetrically, was really no option at all. The knight could no more turn away from the sword and lance than he could take up the pike and join the newly resurgent phalanx. Skill with these traditional weapons, along with the horses he temporarily eschewed to fight the English, defined his whole existence. They were the basis of his education, the heart of his identity, and the prime means by which he measured himself against other men, to say nothing of largely determining his economic status. For the knight, there would be no turning back. He was the human equivalent of some over-specialized reptile. As conditions changed, he was locked into a response pattern which could only exaggerate what had once made him invincible. Yet the future would not countenance such sanctuaries, and the dream would persist in other weapon systems. And what of the longbowman? Ultimately, he would prove to be only a transitional figure. Yet his existence was, in a number of ways, a portent of things to come. First, the English yeoman archer, along with his cousins the crossbow-toting Genoese and Pisan mercenaries, had succeeded in significantly undermining the basic Western animus against killing at a long range. While these prejudices would never quite be extinguished, this constituted the decline of a tradition which stretched back to Homer and beyond, and its partial replacement by an ethic which would in large part make modern war possible. Furthermore, the premeditated establishment of a killing zone introduced in a major way the element of total impersonality into European warfare, a feature which has become characteristic of our own military experience. Individualized combat would also persist. Yet chance and the faceless agents of death would more and more come to rule the battlefield. In the near term, the longbowman's fate was similar to that of other weapons practitioners. Rather than suicidal charges of the French nobility, he would come to feel the sting of his own cloth-yard shafts. For at home in England, symmetry reasserted itself, and battle became increasingly a matter of withering arrow barrages. Though it is probable that many filled the ranks of Wat Tyler's rebel forces, by and large, the longbowmen remained the pawn of the competing noble factions struggling to unite the country. Thus, at Shrewsbury in 1403 and later in the great battles of the Wars of the Roses, opposing formations of longbowmen volleyed thousands of arrows into each other's lines until the projectiles became intolerable and the issue was settled at close quarters. The result was appalling. On Palm Sunday, 1461, a day-long battle fought in a blizzard on Towton Heath resulted in something like 25,000 killed or wounded, a slaughter so great that the waters of the little river Cock ran red for miles. As contemporary illustrations show, more and more the archers sought refuge behind plate, half armor, or even full armor. Yet it was no more of a refuge for him than for the nobility, for there was a new weapon abroad which would prove consistently capable of penetrating any armor. In 1346, as Edward III moved towards Crécy-en-Ponthieu, the evidence indicates that he carried with him not one but two military surprises. The first, of course, was the longbow, not yet seen on the continent and destined for stunning success. But the second, a curious fire tube made and supplied by the armorers in the Tower of London, had practically no effect on the battle, though it does seem to have been fired. Though 240 years later, in 1588, when Britain mustered her forces to face the expected Spanish invasion, not a single longbow would remain among the trained troops. In the interim, the odd fire tube had replaced them all, and the age of man-powered warfare had drawn to a close. Much the same sequence of events took place in military naval architecture. Political consolidation, accelerated development, a re-exploration of prior initiatives, and then great change. As in the Hellenistic era, the key institutional change appears to have been the establishment of naval arsenals consciously dedicated to improving ship types. While France, England, Portugal, and Spain would all set up government-operated wharves, the model for all, and the most seminal influence in naval architecture during the period from 1300 to 1550 was the arsenal at Venice. Its success was almost immediate, with the yard's first experiments in galley design resulting in radical improvement over the dromon shortly before 1300. By placing three rowers, on the same level seated in echelon, all using sweeps of different lengths, the Venetian designers kept the center of gravity as low as possible and produced probably the optimal propulsion system for the oared ram. Shortly thereafter, as part of the naval program prompted by the Second Genoese War, the innovative shipwrights at the arsenal would begin to explore the possibilities of much larger galleys. So enthusiastically, in fact, that the government quickly clapped limits on the size of war vessels. This was a rare occurrence. Having drifted into a policy of a shipyard owned and operated by the state, the authorities thereupon sought to optimize conditions, enlarging the area in 1305 and again in 1325, and consciously attracting engineering talent with the opportunity to exercise it with a minimum of outsized interference as to technical matters. Once again in the arsenal, however, designers and artisans alike were faced with the problem of communicating their ideas, and since the yard was a continuing endeavor, preserving them for the future. This led directly to the first treatises on shipbuilding and the beginnings of standardized naval design. This was of particular significance, since hull construction was undergoing major changes in both northern and southern Europe, with heavy, largely unsupported outer planking systems giving way to a light external shell and extensive reliance on internal framing, thereby gaining strength and saving wood. Yet the arsenal's influence in these matters was not solely a function of warship design. This is an important distinction. Unlike the Hellenistic monarchs, the dominant political element in Venice owed its power and wealth primarily to commerce, and the larger galleys produced in the arsenal were a significant component of their success. For these vessels were at the heart of the south-north alum wool trade and their pilgrim spice shuttle to the Levant. In order to further encourage their construction, private shipbuilders were supplied with certain parts by the arsenal and offered inducements to work there. Thus, rather than being a sterile hybrid devoted to purely military ends, the arsenal was fueled by the fires of commerce which were taking hold of Europe's future. Indeed, it was the design of trading galleys, not the development of pure warships, which revealed most definitively the limits of oared ships. For the desire to carry more cargo and build bigger ships was innately at odds with efficient propulsion, since beyond a certain point extra oarsmen could be added only at great sacrifice to valuable cargo space. Coincidentally, with the oarsman's burden growing heavier and more hopeless was a general diminution in his status. Very soon only slaves, criminals, and the unwilling would serve in the galleys, and, coupled with the general depopulation engendered by the Black Death, the problem of filling the benches would become chronic after 1350. Yet it was the introduction of the gun that would finish the ancient oared warship as a prime naval weapon. Besides largely invalidating its primary armament, the ram, guns were heavy and required a broad, stable platform not easily satisfied by a galley. Rather, it made more sense to place them on a sailing vessel. Not only could such ships be built beamier, but as T.C. Lethbridge notes, they were undergoing a revolution in sail design and rigging during the early 15th century, which would remove most of their shortcomings in speed and maneuverability. Not illogically, it was the arsenal at Venice which would first combine the heavily reinforced internal construction, full ship's rigging, and low hull configuration dedicated to optimal placement of guns to produce, during the early years of the 16th century, the galleon, the first truly successful warship based on firearms, and the archetype of all that would follow over the next 300 years. The transition from mechanical to chemical-powered warfare was one of the major watersheds of man's history, a transformation that would change forever the rhythms of war and weapons development. For it is a singular fact that at the twilight of the former era, all the traditional martial components, at sea the oared ram, and on land the nomad horse archer, the cataphract, the foot archer, the phalangite, even the Spanish reincarnation of the Roman legionary, remained to a lesser or greater degree viable. After 4,000 years or more of less, after 4,000 years of more or less constant warfare, none had been completely wiped off the field of battle, a fact which says something very fundamental about weapons development at this level of technology. Not only did the course of arms appear cyclic, but it is reasonable to assume that, had it not been for the imposition of chemistry, all these basic types would have persisted indefinitely. Plainly, this was more than a matter of technical factors. From an objective standpoint, some weapon types were clearly dominant, the horse archer, for example. Yet within reasonable limits, the choice of arms during this period seems to have been determined more by considerations of politics, sociology, anthropology, and tradition than by effectiveness. This would change dramatically over the era stretching from approximately 1500 to 1945. Yet in no case would military technology proliferate in an atmosphere devoid of military culture. New weapons would always have to be integrated with, and made relevant to, the ethos surrounding military organizations. Yet this matrix was largely a function of the era of man-powered weapons, just as its own course was deeply influenced by attitudes developed in a time dominated by hunting, not war. Thus, free-floating fantasies of heroic combat and armored archetypes, sweeping nomadic attack, and staunch phalanxes would tint the visions of weapons developers and users right up to modern times. The logic of weapons symmetry, the fondness for the horse, the penchant for size, the love of speed, the urge to make noise, and the yearning to identify and confront are not merely of antiquarian interest. They are the progenitors of our own death machinery, frequently metamorphosed by time and technology, but nonetheless driven by the same logic, serving the same ends. This is why it is worth knowing the history of these weapons.